time on such a busy day. So welcome everyone to the Public Affairs Association of Canada's National Energy Policy Panel. And so this is a national webinar that's being broadcasted across the country, and it's geared to a wide range of public affairs professionals, from consultant lobbyists to in-house lobbyists, lawyers, folks in the oil and gas sector, nuclear sector, etc. So before we get started, I just want to remind everyone about a couple of housekeeping items to start off. On the bottom panel, there is a chat function where you're and a Q&A function. And in the Q&A function, you're able to submit questions for our panelists throughout the entire panel. So feel free to do that at any point during the conversation. Secondly, if you're not on mute, please be sure to be on mute throughout the whole time, just to make sure that we have no background noise during the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and following the conclusion of this webinar, we will circulate the recording as well as any answers to questions that we are not able to get to throughout this webinar today. So without further ado, I will get started by giving an overview of today's panel. So the purpose of this panel is really to kind of discuss about what the repercussions are for a weakened energy sector throughout COVID-19, and how do we, as public affairs professionals, how do we navigate through this challenging time in Canada's energy sector. Obviously, COVID-19 has really changed things around quite a bit, and so what can we learn from this pandemic, and what do we need to think about as the economic crisis continues, and also what do we need to do in terms of the resources sector playing a role moving forward in Canada's energy sector, not only during the pandemic, but also what does Canada's energy sector and policy should look like as a result of COVID-19. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists for today's webinar. So at the top left corner is Mike Gladstone from Enbridge Gas. Kim Rudd is with the Canadian Nuclear Association. Kim is also a former member of Parliament for the Grey riding of Northumberland, Peterborough South, and Ted Gruetzner from Global Public Affairs. And I'm Alex. Once again, my name is Alex Greco. I'm with Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. That's its Director of Manufacturing Policy Government Relations, and I am also the chair of the Public Affairs Association and its Ontario chapter. So without further ado, let's kick it right off with I think quite an opening question just to start off. So, and I'll turn to Ted to kind of kick us off here. So Ted, I mean, you know, we've chatted a lot, I know offline, but also in the media, there's been a lot of talk around the oil and gas sector and what role it plays. So maybe you could start us off to talk about what role you feel the oil and gas sector will play as a result of COVID-19, and how do you think public affairs professionals work with governments to ensure that there is a robust energy policy going forward?
Sure, thanks, and welcome everybody. And I know that we're competing with a space launch in the States, so I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Yeah, so I think that I'll start off with the blanket statement that despite what some have said lately, oil and gas is not dead. Oil and gas is going to be a major part of the Canadian energy world and a major part of our economy for a number of years. I think anybody who thinks that is either got a political agenda or just doesn't understand the facts. So that, despite that, you know, I think that there will be changes in the oil and gas sector. There's no question of that. Some positive. The oil and gas, everybody knows who's on the call, has had a number of other issues unrelated to COVID-19. Low prices, the low demand related to COVID-19 have done a triple, quadruple whammy on the sector. But I think that being said, there's going to be oil and gas will be a key part of the recovery. You know, it's 10% of the GDP. There's thousands of people across the country. And I think this is the part that gets forgotten, is how many people in places like Ontario who manufacture parts and provide services to the oil sector. So it's the forgotten part of that discussion. The oil sector goes away. A lot of the manufacturing jobs in Ontario go away. So I think it's going to be a key thing. I think one of the things that the COVID-19 response has done is increase the profile of what we do with oil and gas. I think that there is a deliberate attempt sometimes on folks to portray oil and gas as an industry as a simple case of extraction and export and to make our cars go. I think the discussion that is now taking place is, well, what do we do with this oil and gas? Well, we make plastics, we make the N95 masks, we make the elastics that go, the plastic shields. So this, as we repatriate our supply chain, I think that the oil and gas sector and look at things like our food security, supply chain security, the oil and gas sector in terms of what it's actually produces outside of the product itself is going to be an important part. So what do we do? I think that, like a lot of industries, we should use this as a chance to reset and start a new discussion. Take a look at, well, what did we do as public affairs professionals that worked, and what have we been doing that didn't work? And then stating the obvious, don't do what we kept doing that didn't work, and start focusing on the things that did work. I spent a lot of time in the nuclear industry, and what I've learned quickly there was that some of the oil sector, transferring over here, is that the sector reminds me of the nuclear industry a long time, about 20 years ago. So some of the things that you just got to learn is that the things you did and you're crying, it doesn't work, you got to switch. So, so what do we do? I think that also as an industry and as a country, we got to take a less binary approach to energy. You started to see elements of that. The CNA having John Gorman at its helm now, to me, was a big step. And take a Team Canada approach. So we've got a remarkable clean tech sector. The oil sector has done a remarkable job on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and its emission intensity. It's not a well-known story. Still work to do, of course, but we've got a clean tech sector that wants to help with that. We've got a very strong renewable sector, so let's be honest about where it can apply. Not fight it where it does work, be realistic about where it doesn't. And I won't steal Kim's thunder, but we've got a role to play for nuclear. Ontario got off coal in large part because of the nuclear success story. There's an emerging, Canada could be a leader in small modular reactors. So let's not dismiss it because of some ideological things. So that's where I think that we got to go. And I think that we got to sort of look at, when we go to, talking to Ottawa, we have to understand as professionals, take back that narrative of what we do with our products, what we do for the economy on a broad scale, start telling that story about the manufacturing, start telling the story about the usage. And I've seen my conservative friends talk about the progressive majority in Canada, that 65% of the people vote for a center-left progressive party. And I think that we as an industry have to start to look, well, what is it about those people that makes them able to heat their homes with natural gas or fuel oil, drive an SUV, like one of my neighbors who has a all-wheel drive SUV with a Stop Line 9 on it, or a Stop TMX sticker. And so like, well, what is it about that mentality that says, okay, the people in central Canada are the biggest users of this product, but are probably the biggest protesters against pipelines, extraction, et cetera. So let's try to figure this out. What is it about this group of people that we can work on? Because these are the people that are driving a lot of the policy. The policy leaders in Ottawa are listening to this progressive majority when they're in their thinking. So anyway, I'll stop there. We could go on forever, but I don't want this to be a lecture. I'd like it to be a conversation with the team and also those out there who want to pose questions. So I'll stop there.
No, great. Thank you very much, Ted. Kim or Mike, there's a lot to unpack what Ted just mentioned. So Kim, maybe you want to just add to that, and then Mike, I'll turn over to you.
Sure. I just, Ted brings up a good point. It has been binary. It has been, oil and gas as an example and everything else, or nuclear and everything else. And to your point about 65–70% of the population voting center left, it was a message that Canadians want government to deal with climate change. And I think you're right. The oil and gas sector has not told, I don't think they've told their story well. When I was at Fort Mac or I was out in Calgary, I was able to see firsthand, and I was able to talk to folks about some of the innovation that's happening. And it's been going on for decades, but the credit hasn't been there for the decades. And I think one of the ways that we address that is by recognizing that Canada has an energy ecosystem. It's not one thing or the other. And it's not one thing. I think there's value in the ecosystem working together to help the government form policy.
Yeah.
So I think it's really a road we need to go down. The SMRs you mentioned, and we'll talk a bit about them later, but they have a specific purpose. It won't be the answer to everything. And your point about oil and gas, and so few people know. They think of the big SUV and putting fuel in it, or their homes. But the products, and I will just say this, I watched Brad Wall and Elizabeth May sort of do a bit of a debate a couple of weeks ago. And of course, you know, Elizabeth came out with a statement that the oil and gas sector should be shut down in Canada. And I'm watching her, and she's wearing glasses, and she has earbuds, and, you know, she's wearing clothes. And all of those elements do, you know, come from the oil and gas sector, from the plastics. And so I think that we have to reframe some of the stuff that's happening, but the ecosystem, to me, where we all work together to help form the policy, recognizing we all have a role to play, is the way to go.
Yeah, for sure, Kim. And I think this is a good segue to kind of bring Mike in too, right? Because we talk about, you know, as part of this entire conversation, how do we leverage, you know, Canada's natural resources advantages to focus on opportunities for growth? And so, you know, how does natural gas play into this? But also, what are some policies, Mike, that you think decision makers should think about in order to introduce natural resources development strategies, but also what is economic development and new energy infrastructure, and maybe the creation of, you know, new energy corridors in Canada to spur Canada's energy policy in a post-COVID world?
Yeah. Well, thank you, and thank you, Ted and Alex and Kim, for getting us started. I can't let the Line 9 comment go. If they have a Stop Line 9 bumper sticker, A, not a lot of people seeing it these days, and B, it's got to be an old truck, so maybe not as fuel efficient as it should be. But we all carry those memories with us. Maybe just one quick comment before I start about where we should go, and that's about where we come from. And it was only a few short months ago in Canada where the economy had screeched to a halt. We had blockades and protests across this country talking about that exact binary debate. And we cannot, as a country, go back there. We have to, and as public affairs professionals, we have to help all governments find a pathway forward. And that pathway forward is finding new ways to talk about energy. It's not doubling down on something else. And one of those something else is education. We have thought in industry for a long time that if we educated enough people, if we told the story enough, people would hear it and think about us differently. And part of the challenge is they don't, because they don't hear it. Right. They start from their own political views or their own geographic views about the oil and gas sector. So where do we go? First of all, there is no silver bullet. There is no single answer. It's multiple pathways, multiple discussion points, lots of opportunities to deal with this. And that's how we got through COVID too. We've survived the last few months, in some cases, literally, because of the energy system, because it's secure, because it's safe, and because it's reliable in this country. We've had the health system that we've had function through this crisis. We've had our supply chains function through this crisis. If you're lucky enough to be working and you're working from home, that's relied on a significant changes to our energy systems too, and that has all been sustainable through this process. So let's remember that. That takes investment. So where do we go? I've got 4 policy points that I'd make, and they're very short. The first one, for any Canadian made in Canada energy policy, it has to be egress, egress, egress. We have a product that the world wants more of. We have a product that the world should have more of, and so we need to get it to them. And that's not just oil and gas, that's across our energy value chain. The second one is we have a product that we should be proud of. It competes on affordability, competes on reliability, and it competes on carbon. That in many cases, and that goes for oil and gas too, it's a cleaner, lower emission product that we can offer the world. The third point I'd make is it has to include Indigenous Canadians, and it has to include broader, generally Canadians. They have to see the value in our energy systems for them. And the fourth one is technology. Our energy policy going forward has to include carbon capture, use and storage. We're not going to meet our emissions targets without it. Hydrogen, renewable natural gas. There are endless opportunities to continue to innovate. The industry's been very good at it, and I'd say those are the four pillars.
Right. And I think, and Mike, to build on that, we just got a question from Jason Cameron, and maybe this kind of builds on, I think this builds on to what you're talking about. So those, four policy pillars that I think you've mentioned, I guess, what is the role of government in recovery and how it relates to how active the government should be, whether it's federal or provincial, in choosing, post-COVID winners and losers when we talk about energy policy and the role of different energy uses, whether it's natural gas, nuclear, oil and gas, etc. Kim, maybe do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, as we talk about having the theme of this webinar is about post-COVID-19. And I think one of the things we've seen is, I won't say unprecedented, but maybe unprecedented in the recent past, cooperation between federal, provincial, municipal governments. That has, I think, surprised a lot of people. And has resulted, to Mike's point, in a number of pathways that have resulted in people and businesses getting what it is they need to get through this. And so I think we have an opportunity to capitalize on that in terms of energy policy going forward. There's goodwill, there's cooperation, and there is I think of the memorandum of understanding that was signed a few months ago by Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick.
Right.
In the past, I think nuclear has been seen as being fairly Ontario and New Brunswick centric. But the reality is SMRs provide the opportunity for it to be pan-Canadian because of the opportunity with, resource extraction, on-grid, off-grid, all of those things, off-coal, Saskatchewan particularly. So I think as we look at the broader question of sort of what next and what can governments do, there are a number of things they are doing and more things will have to be done. But there will be a point, in my opinion, where they will be looking at some big, bold moves because we need big, bold, frankly. Small incremental things are getting us through the crisis, but as we move to the next step. And I think part of our role as the energy ecosystem is to help governments see how those bold steps can be realized and operationalized. I think that's our role. And there are two things: climate change and economic recovery that will be the focus of whatever, particularly the federal and provincial governments do. So I think with those things in mind, we have this opportunity. I'll leave it there.
Ted, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. And Mike and Kim made some great points. The one thing I just was an aside I found interesting, jumping from the electricity sector to dealing a lot with oil and gas, was that we don't even agree what the term energy means in Canada. My friends in Calgary were astounded that the Ministry of Energy in Ontario spent like almost zero time on oil and gas issues, and almost all of its time on electricity. So it was just an aside. I think, though, to build on Kim's point, I think one of the things I think that we can help shape is focusing what the first principles of the recovery should be. In terms of, we're not far off on a lot of these things, and it may be the narcissism or tyranny of minor differences that often prevents policymakers and industry participants from moving forward. But you look at things like every company has some form of an ESG governance strategy, which is not really that far off from what government policy is. So let's figure out where we can match there, but also getting back to the first principles on what is it we're trying to do. I think often policy, in my experience of being around for a long time, is that it gets grafted onto existing services, existing systems, and it often doesn't fit. So you get these kind of weird hybrids. But we do have a great opportunity. And the one that always sticks in my mind, and I know we're talking mostly oil and gas, but it's somewhat related, is electric cars, where the policy drivers were to get everybody into electric cars without really caring where the metals that made the batteries came from, without really caring where any of the components came from, or even where the cars came from. It was like, we want people in electric cars. So, but if you kind of take well, what are we trying to do in an economic recovery? Well, then the idea is we've got most of the metals in Canada to make a good battery. Let's use those instead of extracting them someplace else. Let's create jobs and opportunities for First Nations, for people that live in the northern communities, because we've got all the metals. Let's use them. We've got great mines at places like University of Calgary, University of Waterloo, great technical services who can create a battery. Is it too late? Maybe, but why don't we look at, can we build a battery? And then look and say, well, where do all the plastics go to make an electric vehicle light enough to actually work? Well, they come from Alberta. They come from the Saskatchewan oil and gas sector. So what are we trying to do? Well, we want to get people electric cars, but we're going to do a broad stream approach to this, and our policies will reflect how do we get the most out of what our initial policy goal was. And we haven't done that, and I think that this is a chance for us to help frame that conversation. Where do all these little bits fit into a broader economic recovery? I used to have a boss mine when I worked at OPG who always said that he felt that doing an energy policy ahead of an economic policy was a bad idea. That you should start with what your economic policy is going to be and what your economic goals, and then make your energy policy fit that. And so I think that part of the discussion will be, through Finance Minister Marneau, finance committees, is, well, what are we trying to do economically, and how does the energy sector support and build that in? Because we're going to be broke. So how are we going to create the most value, and how are we going to become not only Mike's got a great point. We've got a great oil and gas product that we can export, but can we export anything else? What is it that we can supply the world with to create our own recovery?
And for sure. And so, and Ted, you mentioned First Nations, and I want to kind of dig deeper a little bit on that, because I think the First Nations relations, they played a role in the development or lack thereof, depending on one's perspective on national energy policy. So maybe Mike, I'll go to you, and then tie Kim in. From your perspective, what role do you see First Nations relations play with the federal government in developing energy policy going forward? And maybe where do you see, where common ground could be found, and what are some of the roadblocks that maybe the federal government's going to have to overcome in order to achieve its goals and objectives in the overall energy policy area?
Well, I from an Indigenous participation standpoint, I actually think industry broadly, the energy value chain in this country has done a progressively better job. And so we stand where we are today and feel like we've made great progress with our partners in these communities. And I will say, from an Enbridge perspective, it's changed and adapted a lot over time, because we've not always been the listeners we thought we were. We've not always been the partners that we thought we were. And those have been some hard lessons. But when you stand at the end of line 3 in Canada, and you look back along that line, and you see that literally hundreds of millions of dollars in partnerships, in economic opportunities, businesses that have the contracts, the long-standing change that has happened in how we do supply chain development for a major project, that's all very positive. It's having impacts across our system, not just in Canada. So that's how you go forward. And in fact, if I had one comment for governments, it would be to allow industry to share what we've done better as a place to start with communities. And communities and industry, I'd actually say, are ahead of government on this one. And that's a good thing. Maybe I should stop there.
Yeah. No, and Kim, I'd like you to build on that, but also I know we have a number of folks who are attending today's webinar that are from the nuclear sector. So maybe beyond just what the role First Nations play, can you maybe talk about what you see as the role of nuclear energy, in terms of Canada's national energy policy in a post-pandemic world, and do you think this pandemic will spur the development of SMRs going forward?
So I think Canada is in a great position to advance SMRs, advance nuclear. We have a reputation around the world as being very good at nuclear. if you think of, and one of the things that got us there is, we were talking, Mike, I think was you talking about supply chain. The robust supply chain that has been developed over the years that is helping the $26 billion refurbishment of at both the Bruce and Darlington is really one of the key elements that is the strength of nuclear as we go forward with SMRs. SMRs have, I said earlier, Ontario and New Brunswick are mostly seen as being nuclear centric, but the SMRs have the opportunity to provide clean energy, electrification, thermal, they can produce hydrogen. There are a number of elements that come from SMRs that have value throughout the whole Canadian sphere. If I tie it back to First Nations, when I was parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources, of course, one of our platforms was off diesel for northern remote communities. SMR is an option, but going back to the comment about First Nations, there's work to do to help understand what some of the thinking is of First Nations around nuclear. A lot of First Nations wouldn't have had any exposure to nuclear, and what does that mean? Having said that, there are places like Iqaluit and Nunavut that see this as a great opportunity. So the clean electrification of Canada, which is something that has been talked about for some time, is paramount. When we talk about electric cars, we talk about transportation being electrified, that electricity has to be produced. And it needs to be produced in a way that's accessible to all Canadians, so everyone has access. And there are lots of conversations around interties and energy corridors and those kinds of things. But the reality is the ability of SMRs to be manufactured and moved in modular fashion and expanded as required is something that gives opportunity to places in this country that haven't had that. So what does that look like? It's part of that energy ecosystem I was talking about earlier, and how we leverage all of those elements to make sure Canada is a leader, not just domestically, but there is a huge export opportunity for SMRs and nuclear as a Team Canada approach that someone mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Ted, do you want to have the final word on that before we go to questions from the audience?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one quick thing about the First Nations. Aside, as Mike pointed out, aside from the Constitution, rights and legal cases, it's the proper and right thing to do, building relationships and partnerships. And many companies have been successful at it, but it's a story that's not told or understood. But I will say that just an add-on to that is that anytime there's I think the First Nations get an unfair look in terms of they're stopping projects, they're not allowing things to be built. I was the community manager on a natural gas-fired generating station in downtown Toronto a number of years ago. That was a challenge, as we saw with the Liberal government and the previous McGuinty government. Building things in Mississauga was very challenging. So I think that part of the things as public affairs professionals we have to have all understood is that social license, and that comes from solid operations, but just solid community work in advance of a project. It's solid community work right along the line is a key part of what we do these days. Some companies, I'm surprised, still forget that, but you have to earn social license every day, and that's an operational issue. It's a public affairs issue because building things in Canada is very challenging. Communities have expectations of what they want, and I know putting a line through a pipeline through downtown Toronto would be just as challenging as putting it through a First Nation community. So. These are, I just want to make sure that people understand that it's not just First Nations who are seen as the blockage of the situation. So,
no, that's very well put, Ted. And certainly, I think on this topic we could talk all day long. But so we have 15 minutes left. So I do want to turn to the audience for questions. So first question comes from Simmer Anand from Hydro One, and so Simmer asks, what role do you see the government playing in the electricity sector, and how does the industry increased load growth. Who wants to tackle that, Ted or Mike?
I could take a stab at it if you want. If you then Mike can jump in. Yeah, I mean, I assume that similar means nationwide, not just Ontario specific. But I think that Kim alluded to this. There's a big potential for electrification within the gas sector. It's one of the things I was astounded is how the potential there's, the BC government did a report not too long ago about how much carbon you could take out of the system through electrification. I think what's going to happen there is a conversation about how you treat that on a regulatory basis. There are some issues of who's paying for infrastructure, obviously, who's going to pay for a line, who's going to help build a microgrid where applicable, or put an SMR in where applicable. But some of it gets down to just a mundane regulatory issue of how you pricing electricity versus natural gas. So if it's cheaper for me to run natural gas and the regulator won't allow me to do a system benefit price on my electricity, I'm not going to switch to electricity unless there's some economic incentive there. So I think that's part of the discussion. I think there has to, and I know this was happening before, because I know that this was going to be part of budget discussions, was assumptions of who paid for things like lines, like through, was changing within government, and that they realized that the federal government had a role to play in helping support transmission grids. We saw them help fund the line between Manitoba and Saskatchewan, for example. So I think that's the role that government can play. In terms of electricity load growth, I mean, I think there's opportunity. I mean, that gets back to how do we build our industrial base? I mean, people forget, I'm more familiar with the Ontario situation, but we lost like about 25% of our demand because the manufacturing disappeared. So if we can build manufacturing back, then there's your load growth right there. I mean, people are going to be more efficient. People are more cost effective coming out of this. So pricing is going to be an issue, but that's where I see the government playing a role in how to support the electricity system. And then we've got places like hydroelectric, for example, that we're leaders on that. So there's opportunity there as well.
No, for sure, Ted. And just, I think, from an Ontario perspective, I mean, Ontario manufacturers, they pay up to 75% more in electricity costs when you compare us to major jurisdictions. And so I think electricity is an economic development issue at the end of the day. If we don't leverage that as an economic development tool to encourage growth, investment, how are we going to get manufacturing to be built here? If I know the premier's talked about manufacturing being called in Ontario be the manufacturing capital of Canada, but if we don't have that industry growth, where do we, and that load growth, what does that mean for electricity pricing, going forward? So totally hear you on that. Mike, do you have any comments to build on what Ted has said?
Yeah, I mean, I'm I don't come, although we do have electricity generating assets and a transmission line, I don't pretend to be an expert in the electricity business. But maybe a general comment, which is the role of government in energy coming out of COVID is not to pick winners and losers. It's not to, and I would I'd counter Kim just a little bit on this, which is, we actually need to get some one base, maybe double base, single base, double base runs in here if we're going to rebuild our economy post-COVID. And we can't try standing at the base, first up to bat, try to hit a grand slam every time, and that's it's not going to work. And so what can government do? Be a little patient, understand that it's multiple pathways. We have low-hanging fruit still. Industry across the energy value chain has numerous ideas to lower emissions, increase supply at competitive rates. Right. Government has a role in many of those to help get the economics right. But if you're dealing with the pinch points, I think government will leverage the private sector to much greater effect than if they try to swap it all over in a short term.
Yeah, you mentioned the word patience, and I think this next question that we got from an anonymous attendee is very fitting in terms of the word patience. So I'm gonna let Kim start us off here, and then I'll probably let Ted chime in after that. So the question is, I would welcome views from panelists on cooperation with the United States in post-COVID environment, especially with the upcoming U.S. election, where Joe Biden has said no go to Keystone. What's the prospect for Canada-U.S. energy cooperation post-COVID. Kim, your thoughts?
Wow. Well, Canada and US have always demonstrated cooperation. Sometimes it's been a little hard to get to the, to the handshake, but they have. And it's because it's not just about energy, it's about energy security as well. And we are, we supply a lot of energy, electricity particularly, to the US. We provide uranium for their nuclear reactors. We're an integrated system in terms of energy. I think in terms of Keystone, I mean, the Prime Minister has come out and said he will continue to support it. The government's been very clear that they support Keystone. I think we have to, as Mike said earlier, show a little patience, because I do believe in diplomacy. I do believe in negotiation. And I think at the end of the day, so do governments. And it will be, I'm not going to say it's going to be an easy path, but it is something that I think came out of left field. No one was expecting it. But we also have strength in this, given our energy ties to the US. And it's in our best interest as a country to support Keystone XL. And I don't think that changes.
Right. Mike, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely an integrated system. 65% of Canada's crude leaves Canada on the Enbridge system. That is energy that until about 2014 was going straight into PADD 2 in the Chicago area to feed those refineries. It has been decades that the US Gulf Coast has been hungry for that Canadian crude. And we now have a pipeline, the Seaway Flanagan system, that moves into the US Gulf Coast. The point is, they still want it. And good partners work together to figure out ways to work together on this. So patience, we've learned patience in the pipeline sector on all fronts, and disappointment. But ultimately, the same rules apply, which is persistence and patience.
Yep. If I could just add, I think we were chatting before the webinar started. What politicians, and with all due respect to Kim's former profession, what politicians have to say to maintain their base and get themselves base motivated and elected is often very different than what they actually end up doing if they get elected. So I think we should be, to preach the patience is see what happens, who wins, and what he actually does as a priority when he gets in. So.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Oh,
can I just jump in one more time on that, Alex and Ted? I think that's a fantastic point that just triggered something for me, which is actually in Canada, we can do a better job of talking about North American opportunity and energy as well. And we don't. We talk about it, very, very insular to ourselves. We should be talking about North America's opportunity and energy, because that's a way to try to get our US colleagues to talk the same way. It's not egress from Canada that's the issue. It's egress from North America to other parts of the world. And that's across the energy value chain. And if we talk that way, maybe some more colleagues in the US would join us there.
Yeah, no, for sure. For sure. We have a question from Jacqueline Menendez, and she asks, with the rise of more clean energy manufacturing and operations, with workers being assisted in making the technical transition through training, whether it's paid for industry or the various levels of government, what do you see the role of clean energy manufacturing? What role does clean tech fit into this transition as we go forward? And it's kind of tied into the fact that I know the new advocacy group that is on, is going to maybe touch on that a little bit. But what are the panelists' views on what the role of the clean tech transition fits into energy infrastructure? Ted, you want to start us off there?
Yeah, sure. I think I mentioned this in my opening remarks. I think we have a great opportunity because we have a really, really strong clean tech sector. And if you look at what the oil and gas industry was doing with the CRIN program, and that's been going on for a number of years, sort of an industry-led discussion of how do you decarbonize the industry. We have a great base to build on. And getting back to that less binary, you need a clean tech sector, sure. I think it was Minister O'Regan said a while ago, you can't have a clean tech sector without a strong oil and gas industry. To me, that was a great recognition by the federal government that they do go hand in hand. And to that, what do clean tech sector people need? They need business opportunities. So you've got an opportunity with, in Canada, and my own view is that gives you another export opportunity, because other people who are struggling with greenhouse gas emission reductions can say, well, how did you do it, Canada? Well, we used this technology that came out of the University of Ontario technology, just not his name anymore, but UOIT out in Oshawa. We used a product from the University of Waterloo that they developed, or this private company that had this technology. So we have to look at how are we going to do a Team Canada approach? What are we trying to accomplish? And so I think that there's ways that they can work together. And getting back into even clean tech in homes. I mean, so if we can reduce our own carbon footprint in terms of how we're using them around the houses, well, then there goes some of our intensity issues in terms of export opportunities. So, which furthers our Article 6 opportunities. So there's a way that we just have to work together. We can't just continue off on separate paths, or it's not going to work.
Right, for sure. Kim, do you want to build on that?
Just, Mike mentioned it, and Ted just did, about the different paths. And one of the things that was developed, and I'm sure you folks know about, the SMR roadmap, which came out about a year and a bit ago. It came out because SMRs were being talked about in the nuclear sector in 1,000 different ways, with 1,000 different technologies, different ideas. And there was a recognition that, to Mike's point about not picking winners and losers, there had to be a path forward. And within that roadmap, there are a number of them with off-ramps, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's a recognition that this is complicated. This is not this is the way we go, or that's the way we go. And I think we have to look at it that way, going back to where I started about there being more than one answer. So I think, and I just want to add, what's the role of government? One of the major roles of government in this whole sort of recovery, whether industry, the energy sector, what we're doing going forward to address climate change, and in the clean tech sector, is about de-risking some of these projects.
Right.
Innovation and technology is risky as we move forward into the next level of what that may be. And one of government's roles, I think, is to de-risk it so it actually comes to fruition. So I think that's one of the things we have to keep in mind.
With 1 minute left, Mike, do you want to have the final word?
That's never happened before. Yeah, sure. I mean, I just think, those have been great points. What can government do? I'd look to the federal government for the infrastructure bank. I think there's opportunities actually to broaden that mandate to help more projects faster across that line, and from a broader array of energy, of the energy sector. Secondly, those in the industry know what we are doing to address emissions and climate change, to invest in new technologies. Canadians, if you don't tend to be out west and in the industry, you either don't know it or you don't believe it. And I think we can work with government to tell a better story there, and government investment and support, public investment and public support is one way to do that.
On that note, I think that was a great way to end this session. And I know this could have went on for a couple hours, but we are at time. So first off, to kind of conclude, I want to thank Mike, Kim, and Ted for joining us today. I know they have very busy schedules, and certainly this has been a fascinating conversation where we've touched on everything from Keystone to SMRs to Made in Canada to nuclear to industrial electricity pricing, among all other topics. So I really want to thank all of them for joining us today. I also want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. As I mentioned at the start, this webinar is being recorded, so we will be circulating the recording afterwards. I know there were a few other questions that came through, so we'll be sure to get answers to everyone to those questions that weren't answered. Also, if you haven't checked us out online, our website is publicaffairs.ca. If you haven't renewed your membership for 2020, there is still time for you to renew your membership, and you can do so on our website. For those who aren't a member of PAC, PAC's a great opportunity to have an opportunity to be on webinars like this, but also be on our member committees, anywhere from events, marketing, communications, advocacy, among other committees we have. You also have an opportunity to receive our members only newsletter and to be able to participate in a wide variety of other activities, including our annual general meeting and our conference every year. So I encourage everyone to check us out again at publicaffairs.ca. And then finally, our next webinar is going to be taking place on June 10th. And Greg Lyle, the president of Innovative Research Group, will be joining us to talk on what is happening, not only in Ontario, but across Canada in terms of COVID-19, what are the reputations are for industry sectors as a result of the pandemic, and what are the latest polling that we're seeing across all governments, and what are some of the key issues that we're seeing across the country. So be sure to stay tuned for all the different details that are going to be coming out very shortly on that event. And lastly, I do want to give a couple special thank yous to Lois Marsh, who assisted us with this webinar, as well as Talisha Thorogood, who co-organized this event with me. She's with Baskin Marno and the president of the PAC Alberta chapter. So everyone, on behalf of everyone at the Public Affairs Association of Canada, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.